mean I'll see it.
You know how you can sometimes swear you remember something so clearly, like the exact color of a shirt or the way a room looked, only to find out you were totally wrong? Usually, it's something small, like where you left your keys or a line from a movie. But what happened to us, to my group of friends back in sophomore year, wasn't a little slip of memory. It was like a piece of the world just got cut out with a pair of scissors, leaving this jagged, raw edge that we're still trying not to fall into. There were 6 of us living in that cramped, drafty suite in the North dorms. Me, Sarah, Mike, Chloe, Jason, and Kevin. At least, that's how it was for the first 5 months. Kevin was Chloe's boyfriend. He wasn't a student at our tech college. He worked at a garage a few towns over and drove this beat-up, forest green sedan that always smelled like burnt oil and cheap pine air fresheners. He was a loud guy, always wearing those heavy work boots that clattered on the linoleum floors, and he had this laugh, this wheezing, high-pitched sound that you could hear from the other end of the hallway. We spent every weekend together. I remember sitting on the floor of our common room, ordering pizza, and Kevin always complaining that we never got enough pepperoni. I remember him helping Mike move that massive oak dresser up 3 flights of stairs, his face turning a deep, bruised purple from the effort. I even remember his 21st birthday. We bought him a cheap cake from the grocery store, and he accidentally blew a spray of crumbs all over Chloe when he tried to put out the candles. It's not just a vague feeling of a person, it's a library of specific, mundane moments. Then, about 3 weeks ago, we were all sitting in the campus dining hall. Chloe was scrolling through her phone, and Mike made some joke about how Kevin would probably finish her fries if he were there. Chloe stopped scrolling. She looked up, her forehead all wrinkled in genuine confusion, and asked who Mike was talking about. We all laughed, thinking it was some inside joke we weren't in on yet, but she didn't join in. She just kept staring at us like we'd started speaking a different language. She told us she didn't know anyone named Kevin. She said she'd been single since she moved in. We thought she was committed to a bit, but then Jason chimed in, and Sarah, and it became clear very quickly that she wasn't joking. She looked scared. So, to prove it, I told her to look at her own Instagram. I remembered her posting a photo of them at the lake over the summer. She opened her profile and handed me the phone. I scrolled back to July. There was the photo of the lake. There was Chloe standing on the pier, smiling at the camera. But she was alone. There was a wide, empty space next to her where Kevin should have been, his arm around her shoulder. The space was so big it looked intentional, like she was posing with a ghost. A cold, sick feeling started to settle in the pit of my stomach, like I'd swallowed a block of ice. We went back to the dorm and started digging through everything. We checked the freshman yearbook, thinking maybe he'd been a student for a semester. Nothing. No Kevin. We looked for the birthday photos. Mike found the one of us gathered around the cake in the common room. In the photo, Sarah is holding the camera, and the rest of us are huddled together. But right in the center, where Kevin was supposed to be sitting behind the cake, there was just an opening. The air in the photo looked distorted, like the heat shimmer you see off a highway in July. You could see the back of the chair through what should have been a human torso. That's when the smell started. It wasn't that pine smell anymore. It was something thick and cloying, like meat that had been left in a sealed plastic bag under a radiator for a week. It wasn't metallic or sharp. It was a sweet, rotting stench that seemed to stick to the back of your throat, making you want to gag every time you took a deep breath. We followed it to the hall closet, a tiny space where we kept our winter coats and some extra cleaning supplies. Jason pulled the door open, and the smell hit us like a physical blow. It was so intense it felt like a thick liquid entering my nose. Inside, tucked behind a vacuum cleaner, was a pair of work boots. They were caked in dried, black mud. I reached out to touch one, and my finger came away wet. It wasn't mud. It was a dark, tacky substance that looked like old jam but felt like grease. It didn't have the bright look of fresh blood. It was dark, almost black, and when I pressed my thumb against it, it felt like rubbing raw fat. As we stood there staring at the boots, Chloe started to scream. Not a loud, theatrical scream, but a low, rhythmic whimpering sound. She was pointing at the wall behind the boots. Someone had peeled back a corner of the cheap, industrial wallpaper. Tucked into the drywall was a collection of things. A set of car keys on a ring with a K keychain. A wallet. A crumpled up receipt from a garage. I opened the wallet. There was a driver's license inside. The name said Kevin Miller. But where the photo should have been, there was just a jagged, empty hole, as if someone had used a cigar to burn the face out of the plastic. The edges were melted and bubbled. That night, none of us could sleep. We all stayed in the common room, lights blaring, sitting close enough to feel each other's heat. The air felt thick, like we were breathing through wet wool. Around 3 a.m., we heard it. A sound coming from the hallway. It wasn't a footstep. It was a dragging sound, like something wet being pulled across the floorboards. Slop. Slide. Slop. We sat frozen. The dragging stopped right outside our suite door. Then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly. Very slowly. We'd locked it, bolted it, and pushed a chair under the handle, but the wood started to groan. The frame began to splinter, the sound of cracking timber echoing like gunshots in the quiet room. A dark, viscous fluid began to seep under the door. It wasn't flowing like water, it was oozing, thick and slow, bubbling slightly as it hit the carpet. It smelled like a slaughterhouse, that deep, visceral scent of open cavities and discarded organs. Then came the voice. It didn't sound like Kevin. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a recording being played at the wrong speed, warped and distorted. It wheezed out a single word, pepperoni. Jason grabbed a kitchen knife, his knuckles white, but he didn't move toward the door. None of us did. We were paralyzed by this overwhelming sense of wrongness, a feeling that if that door opened, we wouldn't just see a monster, we would see something that would unmake our brains. The scratching started then. Not on the door, but coming from inside the walls. It sounded like something blunt and hard was being forced through the plaster. Suddenly, the pressure stopped. The fluid under the door didn't disappear, but it stopped moving. The smell began to fade, replaced by a sharp, ozone scent that stung our eyes. We stayed there until the sun came up, staring at the door. When the campus security finally came after we called them, they found nothing. The fluid on the carpet was gone, leaving no stain. The boots in the closet were gone. The wallet was gone. They looked at us like we were having a collective psychotic break, especially when we showed them the photos. They didn't see the gaps. They just saw a group of friends who didn't know how to frame a picture properly. But here's the thing that keeps me up, the thing that makes me check the corners of my room every 10 minutes. I found a photo yesterday that I'd forgotten I had. It was a Polaroid from that birthday party. In the original photo, the gap is there, just like the others. But as I sat there holding it, the image started to shift. The colors bled together, turning into a dark, fleshy smear in the center of the group. A face started to form in the smear. It wasn't Kevin's face. It was a face with too many teeth and eyes that looked like wet, black marbles pushed into raw dough. It was smiling at me. And as I watched, the figure in the photo reached out its hand and touched the version of me standing next to it. I looked down at my own arm, and right there, on my bicep, was a bruise. A deep, dark bruise in the shape of a hand. It didn't hurt, but when I touched it, I could feel something moving underneath the skin. Something small and hard, like a piece of bone that didn't belong to me. I think Kevin is coming back. Or whatever was pretending to be Kevin is done hiding in the gaps. We're all starting to forget things now. Sarah forgot she had a sister. Mike can't remember his own middle name. The holes are getting bigger, and I'm terrified that one day soon I'll wake up and I won't even remember my own face. I can hear that dragging sound in the hallway again. It's closer tonight. It sounds like it's right behind my head, inside the wall.
Next story.
I never cared much for those internet theories about parallel universes or the Mandela Effect. To me, they always sounded like people just being too stubborn to admit their memory isn't as good as they think it is. But something changed a few months ago, and now I can't look at my own handwriting without feeling like my skin is crawling. It started with those old children's books, the ones about the Bear family. I was a weirdly meticulous kid. My mom used to joke that I was a little professor because I was so obsessed with spelling and grammar. I vividly remember sitting at the kitchen table with her, working on a project for first grade. I had written the name Berenstain on a piece of poster board, and I remember feeling so proud that I hadn't used any because stain was something dirty on your shirt. My mom leaned over, looked at my work, and nodded. She specifically told me that I was right to use the E because it was like Einstein. That memory is anchored in my brain like a physical weight. I can see the steam rising from her coffee mug. I can feel the scratchy yellow sweater I was wearing. Fast forward to last October. My mom passed away, and I was tasked with clearing out the house I grew up in. The attic was a graveyard of my childhood. I found a plastic bin sealed with duct tape, labeled school projects in my mom's neat, cursive script. Inside were the usual things: finger paintings, clay pinch pots, and my old collection of those Bear books. I pulled one out, expecting a hit of nostalgia, but instead, I felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. The cover said Berenstain, with an A. I figured I was just wrong. Memory is a fickle thing, right? I sat on the dusty floor and laughed at myself for being one of those Mandela Effect weirdos for a split second. But then I dug deeper into the bin and found my old first grade book report. It was tucked inside a transparent plastic sleeve, perfectly preserved. On the cover, I had drawn the family of bears. Underneath, in my messy 6-year-old print, I had written the title. But as I looked at it, the air in the attic felt suddenly thin and suffocating. I had written Berenstain. I could see the original E I had practiced so hard. But the paper looked wrong. The ink around that specific letter was distorted. It looked like the fibers of the paper had been physically pulled and rearranged. The E had been smeared and dragged while the ink was supposedly dry, forced into the shape of an A. It didn't look like a person had done it with an eraser. It looked like the reality of the paper itself had been edited by something that didn't quite have the right tools for the job. The A was jagged and ugly, bleeding into the surrounding page in a way that defied physics. I pulled the page out of the sleeve, and my stomach turned. There was a faint, cloying scent clinging to the paper. It wasn't the smell of old musty attic air. It was something sharp and chemical, like the way a hospital corridor smells after a deep cleaning, mixed with something biological and sweet. I started looking through the other books. In every single one, the name was Berenstain. But when I held the covers up to the light at a certain angle, I could see the ghost of the E underneath the laminate. It wasn't a printing error. It looked like the ink had been dragged across the surface of the paper by a microscopic force. I felt a sense of profound wrongness, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to swallow. That night, I stayed in my childhood bedroom. I couldn't stop thinking about that book report. If the universe could go back and change the ink on a piece of paper in a sealed box, what else could it change? I felt like I was standing on a floor that was secretly made of liquid, just waiting for the moment I'd fall through. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound that wasn't a sound. It was more like a vibration in my teeth. I sat up, and the room felt different. The shadows in the corners were too dark, too dense. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my hand hit something else. It was a book. One of the Bear books I had left downstairs. I didn't bring it up with me. I know I didn't. I turned on the lamp, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The book was open to the middle page. The illustration showed the bears sitting around a dinner table. But the faces weren't right. They didn't have eyes. Where the eyes should have been, there were just smooth patches of fur. And the text at the bottom of the page was a jumbled mess of letters that seemed to be shifting and vibrating as I watched them. I stared at the word Berenstain in the corner of the page. As I watched, they began to shimmer. The ink looked like it was melting, turning into a dark, viscous fluid that started to crawl across the page. It wasn't just moving, it was growing. The black liquid began to bubble, and that sweet, chemical stench filled the room, so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. It tasted like rot masked by perfume. I dropped the book, and it hit the floor with a wet, meaty thud. I scrambled back against the headboard, my eyes wide. From the spine of the book, something started to emerge. It wasn't a monster or a ghost. It was a hand. But it wasn't a human hand. It looked like it was made of compressed paper and dried ink, the skin a pale, sickly gray-white with veins of black ink pulsing just beneath the surface. The fingers were long and spindly, ending in sharp points that looked like fountain pen nibs. It gripped the edge of the floorboards and pulled. The sound was like wet cardboard being torn apart. Another hand followed, then a head that was nothing more than a featureless mass of pulped paper. It didn't have a mouth, but I could hear a voice. It wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from inside my own skull. Correction, the voice whispered. It sounded like 1,000 pages turning at once. Error detected. I tried to scream, but my throat felt like it was full of dry cotton. I watched, paralyzed, as the thing crawled toward me. It moved with a jerky, stop-motion rhythm, its limbs cracking and snapping like old book bindings. Everywhere it touched the carpet, the color bled out of the fabric, leaving behind a dull, grayscale smear. It reached the edge of the bed and lunged. I felt those ink-stained fingers wrap around my ankle. They were cold, colder than ice, and they felt dry and abrasive, like high-grit sandpaper. I kicked out wildly, my heel connecting with the thing's chest. It didn't feel like flesh and bone. It felt like kicking a stack of old newspapers. It didn't grunt or cry out, it just kept pulling. I managed to grab the lamp from the nightstand and swung it with everything I had. The ceramic base shattered against the thing's head, spraying shards and gray pulp across the room. The entity recoiled, its face caving in where the lamp had hit. It let go of my leg, and I didn't wait. I bolted out the door, down the stairs, and out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove to a 24-hour diner and sat in a booth, shaking so hard I spilled my coffee. I stayed there until the sun came up, watching the door, waiting for something made of paper and ink to come walking through. When I finally gathered the courage to go back to the house the next day, the attic was exactly as I had left it. The book report was in its sleeve. The books were in the bin. But when I looked at my ankle, there was a bruise. It wasn't purple or blue. It was a deep, charcoal black, and if you look closely, you can see the faint outline of letters stamped into my skin. I sold the house as is. I didn't take anything with me. Not the photos, not the heirlooms, and certainly not the books. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night, the thing that makes me want to scream every time I have to sign my name on a document. A few days ago, I was looking through my wallet and found my driver's license. I've had it for 3 years. I know exactly how my name is spelled. I know exactly what my signature looks like. But the E in my middle name, it looks different now. The ink is slightly darker than the rest of the text. It looks like it was smeared and reshaped while I wasn't looking. And when I run my finger over it, the plastic feels warm. I'm being corrected. I can feel it happening in the quiet moments when I'm not paying attention. A memory of a friend I haven't talked to in years suddenly feels wrong, like a file that's been corrupted. I look in the mirror and my eyes look a shade lighter than they were yesterday. The universe is performing a find and replace on my entire life, and I'm the only one who remembers the original draft. I don't know how much of the real me is left, or if by tomorrow I'll just be another corrected line in a story I never wrote.
Next story.
My brother, Elias, and I used to have this ritual when our parents would go out for their monthly bridge club. We'd head down to the basement, pop a bowl of stovetop popcorn, and dig through the stack of bootleg VHS tapes my uncle had gifted us. One tape stood out from the rest. It didn't have a professional label, just a piece of masking tape with the word "Whiteout" scrawled in black Sharpie. The cover art, which was tucked into a clear plastic sleeve, was a grainy photo of a pair of vintage ski goggles lying in the snow, one lens completely shattered. We watched that movie until the tape started to hiss and track. It was a 90s survival horror flick about 4 hikers trapped in a blizzard in the Cascades. Something was out there in the storm with them, a thing that didn't have a shape of its own, but could mimic the appearance of whoever it killed. I can still see the lead actor, a guy who looked exactly like a younger, more rugged version of Michael Biehn, screaming into the wind as his best friend's face began to slide off like melting wax. A few months ago, Elias and I were having a beer on his porch, and we started talking about the old days. I mentioned the movie, specifically the scene where the hikers realized the rescue dog that found them has human teeth. We both laughed about how much it traumatized us, and then he said we should find a copy online to show his oldest son. He wanted to see if the practical effects still held up or if they were as cheap as most 90s gore. That was the start of it. We spent 4 hours that night on every movie database imaginable. IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, obscure horror forums, nothing. There's a movie called Whiteout from 2009 with Kate Beckinsale, but that's a mystery thriller set in Antarctica. It's not our movie. We searched for keywords: shapeshifter in blizzard, hikers mimic creature, shattered goggles horror movie. 0 results. I called Elias the next morning. I told him we probably just had the title wrong. Maybe it was a Canadian B-movie or a straight-to-video release under a different name. He sounded strained on the phone. He told me he'd gone through the entire filmography of the actor we remembered. We both could have sworn it was Thomas Arana or someone who looked just like him. Elias actually tracked down a fan-run site for the actor and sent a polite email asking about an uncredited horror role in the mid-90s. The response came back 2 days later. The actor was gracious but firm. He'd never been in a horror movie in his life. In fact, he'd been doing theater in London during the years we claimed to have watched Whiteout on repeat. Elias didn't take it well. He drove over to my place with a box of old photos, trying to find a picture of us in the basement where the TV might be visible in the background. We found one. It's a blurry shot of us sitting on the shag carpet, the screen behind us glowing with blue light. You can't see the movie, but on the coffee table, clear as day, is that plastic VHS case with the shattered goggles on the cover. We stared at that photo for a long time. The physical evidence was there in the picture, but the world insisted the object didn't exist. That's when Elias decided we needed to go back to our childhood home. The house had been sold years ago, but the new owners were an older couple who were surprisingly cool about us wanting to look in the crawl space behind the furnace where we used to hide our treasures. The crawl space was cramped and suffocating, the air thick with the scent of old damp earth and rotting wood. I crawled in with a flashlight, my stomach doing slow rolls. I found a bunch of junk, old-school notebooks, a rusted Tonka truck, and a stack of 3 VHS tapes. My heart nearly stopped. I pulled them out into the light. 2 were Disney movies. The third was the tape with the masking tape label. Whiteout. We didn't even wait to get home. Elias has an old TV VCR combo in his garage for when he's working on his car. We hooked it up, our breath visible in the chilly garage air. The tape felt dense in my hand, more substantial than it should have been. I pushed it into the slot. The machine groaned, the gears grinding as they took the spool. The screen flickered with static for a full minute. Then the title appeared in jagged, white letters, wide out. There was no studio logo. No credits. It just started. It wasn't exactly how I remembered it. The hikers were there, but the cinematography felt wrong. It was too raw, like it had been filmed on a handheld camcorder rather than a film camera. The actors didn't feel like actors. They looked genuinely exhausted, their skin raw and peeling from frostbite. We watched the scene where the group finds shelter in an abandoned ranger station. In our memory, this was a tense bit of dialogue. In the video, it was 10 minutes of a woman sobbing while she tried to stitch a wound on her leg. The wound wasn't a clean cut. It looked like something had taken a massive, jagged bite out of her calf, the flesh hanging in gray, lifeless strips. The blood didn't look like stage makeup. It was thick and dark, staining the snow and the floorboards in a way that made my throat tighten. It smelled in that garage, not just the oil and gasoline, but a metallic, raw stench that seemed to be coming from the TV itself. Then the creature appeared. In our memories, it was a cool, animatronic monster. On the screen, it was something else entirely. It walked into the cabin on the legs of the lead hiker, but the torso was a mass of translucent, quivering meat. It didn't speak. It made a sound like wet leather being torn apart. The camera dropped to the floor, and we saw the creature lean over the sobbing woman. It didn't just kill her. It began to press its body against hers, its flesh melting and merging into her skin. You could see her eyes bulging, the vessels popping until her sockets were filled with dark, leaking fluid. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was making a bubbling sound as her lungs filled with whatever that thing was secreting. "Turn it off," Elias whispered. He was backed up against his workbench, his face as pale as the snow on the screen. I reached for the power button, but I couldn't move. I was mesmerized by the gore. It was so detailed, the way the skin stretched and tore, the sound of bones snapping like dry kindling. This wasn't a movie. It was a recording of something that had actually happened. The actor we thought was Michael Bean suddenly looked directly into the camera. He wasn't looking at the cameraman. He was looking at us. His face started to ripple, the features shifting and blurring like a reflection in a disturbed pool of water. His mouth opened, wider than any human jaw should be able to, and his tongue, long, pale, and covered in tiny, hooked barbs, lashed out toward the lens. The VCR made a horrific screeching noise, and the tape suddenly ejected, the brown ribbon of film spilling out like a mess of intestines. We sat in the silence of the garage for a long time. The smell of raw meat lingered, cloying and thick in the back of my throat. Elias finally reached over and grabbed the tangled mess of film. He didn't say a word. He took a lighter from his pocket and set the whole thing on fire in a metal bucket. The smoke was black and oily, and it stung our eyes. The next day, I looked at the photo of us in the basement again. My heart stopped. The photo had changed. In the background, on the TV screen, you can now clearly see a face. It's the man from the tape, his jaw unhinged, his eyes staring straight out of the photograph at whoever is holding it. And the goggles on the VHS cover in the photo? They aren't just shattered anymore. There's a reflection in the glass of the remaining lens. It's a reflection of two young boys sitting on a shed carpet, completely unaware that the thing they're watching is actually watching them back. Elias hasn't slept in a week. He keeps saying he hears the sound of wet leather dragging across the floorboards in his attic. I told him he's just paranoid, that the movie is gone, that we burned it. But this morning, I woke up and found a dusting of snow on my bedroom floor. It hasn't snowed in this city in 3 years. When I touched it, it wasn't cold. It felt like grease, and it left a dark, metallic-smelling stain on my fingertips that I can't scrub off, no matter how hard I try. I think we brought something back with us from that crawl space. Or maybe, after watching that tape, we finally gave it the permission it needed to find us.
Next story. next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.